to enforce a certain concept of what power doesn't.
This association has always been very good to me. I went to my first meeting in 1932.
The existence language. Continued question about whether or not...
Hi everybody, welcome to another enGrama episode. Today we got a big fan.
Proyecto dedicado a la divulgación, formación y terapia psicológica. Consulta nuestros servicios en nuestra web y redes sociales.
Well, so welcome Noam and Charles to a new interview to enGrama. It's a pleasure to have you here again, and we are going to have an interview with both of you. You will introduce yourselves in 1-2 minutes, and then you will have a dialogue about different themes related with psychology, language, behavioral, and other things you want to talk about. So we have nothing more to say. I will give you the word, and you can start when you want.
Okay.
So Charles,
Okay, Charles.
you start, or Noam?
Okay, well, I guess then I'll start. I think maybe it's appropriate for me to start, mainly because I think most people who watch this would know who Noam Chomsky is. And what I will do is start out a little bit by reminding you, Noam, a little bit about the contact we've had over the years, which has not been extensive. It's just been minimal, but we have had contact over the years.
Sean todos bienvenidos a nuestra nueva formación con Santiago Benjumea, grabada presencialmente en alta calidad, avalada con el Certificado Internacional de Análisis de Conducta. Todo lo que necesitas saber sobre psicología del aprendizaje, las respuestas a por qué nos comportamos como nos comportamos, disponible internacionalmente y accesible para toda la vida, cuenta con más de 15 horas de audiovisual, diapositivas, material complementario, con uno de los grandes expertos en habla hispana de psicología del aprendizaje, y además podrás, incluido con todo esto, contar con una sesión virtual online en directo con el propio docente. Tienes toda la información en enGramaPsicología.es.
I was a brand new graduate student at Harvard in the academic year 1958-59, when you came up from MIT to give a talk to the psychology department, and I know that Skinner was in the audience at the time. So I heard you speak very, very early on, at least with respect to my experience. You talked about transformational grammars, you did not mention that you were working on a book review of Skinner's verbal behavior. That came up later on. And then another part of my history that relates to that is that I had been an undergraduate student at Columbia, where I took courses with Fred Keller and Nat Schoenfeld, who had taught a seminar in verbal behavior in which we read Skinner's William James lectures. And during that semester, it was 57, Skinner's book came out. So I was introduced to that as early as I possibly could have been. From there on, I went and I completed my degree at Harvard. I went and did psychopharmacology for a couple of years, but found that not a kind of career I wanted to stick with, and I finally got an academic position, and continued teaching and doing research and so on. A bit later, I wrote a short paper in which I called it something like Chomsky's Transformational Grammar, a Behavioral Translation. And I sent you a reprint of it, and we had a brief correspondence about it. And the thing I find still interesting about it is that those were the days in which we did things with typewriters, and if we made a mistake, we went and fixed it and typed over the thing. And so in some ways, that was a much easier technology than what we sometimes have to deal with today with the computers. So that that was after that exchange. I was doing my things, and you were doing your things, and sometime later, I became involved in the behavioral and brain sciences with Stephen Harnad. And there I learned a lot because Stephen would often send me manuscripts to read. So I was reading things across a broad range of topics. And one of the things I was supposed to do was to attract people to write papers for the behavioral and brain sciences thing. And I wasn't getting anybody to write a paper. And so at one point I had the idea to suggest to Stephen that we pick out a classic paper or two and then have commentators write about the classic paper and the author would respond. And I said that I thought Skinner might be willing to do something like that. And Stephen wondered whether he would, but Skinner agreed to do it. And we ended up with that special issue. My understanding was that Skinner, that Stephen invited you to respond to those papers, but that you did not. And I'd be interested in coming back a little later and maybe talking about why you chose not to respond to any of those at that particular. That was in the 80s. The next thing that I remember in which I was in the audience once when you gave a talk at the University of Southampton in Britain while I was on a sabbatical leave over there, and then a bit later I was in the audience at the Harvard conference, the fourth Harvard conference on the evolution of language. That was the one in which Jackendoff gave the invited address. And I would like to come back to that a little bit because Jackendoff was talking about modules, and I think that might be interesting for us to talk about. I have had some thoughts and concerns about modules, and now we're here. We have a chance to actually talk because you and I have never had a conversation. I'll just say one more thing because I don't want to go on too long. I want to give you a chance to introduce yourself as well. When I began and was taking my introductory course in psychology, the textbook that Keller and Schoenfeld had produced was one in which they pull things from all over. They pull things from different areas of learning, from different disciplines and all. Very different from Skinner's writing, in which he tended to have to concentrate on his own previous research. And the business of pulling things together and trying to see how things fit together has been a sort of a theme of the way I've tried to do things. So, for example, I've had a textbook that's gone through a couple of editions, and as often as I could, I've had chapters on psycholinguistics and linguistics in them, in which I've tried to do my best to present, from my point of view, the kinds of things that you've done and linguists have done. The kinds of things that cognitive psychologists have done. So I tend to, yes, I have to call myself a Skinnerian because after all, I'm a student of his and have continued with that sort of work. But I'm always looking for ways to try to find places where different approaches can come together in a productive way. So I think I've been going on for long enough, and let me turn it over to you for a bit.
Perdonadme un segundito de nada que interrumpa este vídeo. Esto es solo para anunciaros que después de recibir muchísimas peticiones de vuestra parte para que abriéramos un servicio de terapia psicológica online, ya lo tenéis disponible, podéis entrar en nuestra web para más información. Seguid ahora disfrutando del vídeo, un abrazo y nos vemos por el canal.
Let me turn it over to you for a bit and
okay.
See where we go from there.
Have reminiscences from the 50s. I'll add my own. I was a graduate student at Harvard a couple of years before you, early 1950s. I knew about Skinner's verbal behavior. It appeared around the late 40s. It was distributed informally. It was his William James lectures, which came out as verbal behavior about 10 years later. And it was the dominant view in the Cambridge area among those who were interested in what was then called behavioral science. There were a couple of us graduate students who didn't believe any of it. 3, actually. One was Morris Halley, who he and I then went on to establish the linguistics department at MIT. The other was Eric Lenneberg, who went on to, he was a grad student in psychology at Harvard, but the Harvard psychology department in those days was a pretty weird place. There were 3 senior professors. One was Skinner, one was Smitty Stevens, third was George Miller. Skinner and Stevens both knew the absolute truth, but they were opposite truths. And if you were a student of Skinner's, you couldn't take courses with Stevens, and conversely. Well, there were students who weren't really committed to either of the absolute truths. They ended up with George Miller, who was more open-minded, was interested in all sorts of things. So Eric studied with George Miller. George and I later became close friends and colleagues. But we were at the time, early 50s, reading. Eric, Morris, and I were looking at literature which was outside the established canon, mostly European literature on ethology, Tinberg and Lawrence, comparative psychologists in the United States who were outside the canon. I also came across the work by names are gone to me at my age. Yeah. The great psychologist who wrote about serial order and behavior. Come back to me in a minute.
Tinbergen?
No, not Tinbergen. American.
I think Lorenz, Tinbergen.
And a Harvard psychologist who was at the medical school, who great neuroscientist who wrote a very important paper called Serial Order and Behavior, which
yes,
undermine behaviorism. Totally.
I'm having a lapse on his name as well. Yes, serial order and behavior is was one of those things everybody had to read and had to know.
Anyway, his paper was,
and the L is an interfering thing because there's an L in his name.
Anybody has a computer, look up serial order and behavior, and you'll probably find his name. It's his paper, as far as I could see, this is early 50s, completely undermined behaviorism, was unknown in the psychology literature, practically no references to it. Well known.
David Rosenbaum?
No, Lashley.
Carl Lashley, of course, yes.
Thank you.
But we all did know of him, of his work, and in fact took it very seriously. I mean, I don't think that any of us who were studying those kinds of things ever thought that words were strung together and a given word had to be the discriminative stimulus for the next word you were going to say. A word like "the" could be followed by just about anything. And all of us who then worked in those kinds of things, I think, took for granted that yes, you had to know Lashley, and Lashley was correct. And I think that's the idea that chaining was involved, I think, was something that none of us took very seriously. And lately, you'll find that much of the research that people have talked about with respect to sequential behavior involves higher order structured units in which the contiguities of words are really the least important thing about them. So I think we've adopted a lot of those ways of thinking.
Actually, there were very few ways of doing database search in those days. You had to do it by hand. But later it was done, and there were no references to Lashley. in the psychology literature, tons of references in the neuroscience literature. The first reference to it that I know of was in my review of Skinner, which went to press in 1957, which is why I didn't talk about it. It was already in press. But I did talk about Lashley's paper there, and as far as I know, that's the first reference. There was also a famous experiment by George Miller. This was back in the 40s when he was working on signal detection for the Air Force. The theory at the time was that sentences, expressions are formed by just, as you said, by stringing words together. And if you detect a signal from noise, there's a certain probability of its being correct. But every word you add reduces the probability, of course, because there's more noise. So he did this experiment, and he found a very strange result, that when you got to the last word of the sentence, the probability of detecting the sentence from noise shot way up. It should have gone way down. Why was it going way up? Well, because when you understand a sentence, you're putting a whole structure on it, and that determines how you perceive the expression. But that was completely contrary to everybody's belief, so it was just kind of sidelined.
There's that marvelous sentence in Lashley, which is which uses the word right in about 7 or 8 different ways, and it ends up with the person righting the canoe. When that changes everything. I came just a little bit after that, and that was a thing that all of us as graduate students read in the pro seminar, and unfortunately, I arrived in 58, and during 58, George Miller, who I had read George Miller's book as an undergraduate student, and I was hoping to spend some time taking courses with him as well as with the others in the department at the time. But he was on sabbatical that year, and by the end of that year, he and Jerry Bruner left the department to form the Cognitive Center. And at that point, people just stopped talking to each other, which I was troubled by, because now you had groups of people who weren't interested in the way things were changing and what each other were doing. And that I thought had unfortunate consequences over the very substantial period of time afterwards.
Very strange atmosphere at Harvard. As I say, Smitter and Skinner not only couldn't talk to each other, but their students couldn't even take each other's courses.
But I published with Smitty and with Skinner. And by the time things changed even in just a few years later. And I don't know whether it had something to do with George Miller leaving. Many of us then found that it was possible to work at both ends of the lab. But of course, it was just those two things. You learn psychophysics, or you learn the basic animal learning stuff. You could do both. There were a few other things around. And Phil Teitelbaum had left, so that there was no physiological psychology there anymore. So, yeah, it was a strange history, I guess.
Well, I should say, just to continue, that Eric Lenneberg, who did his work with Miller, as many did, went on to found the biology of language. He went to medical school, became a good biologist. His book in 1968, 69, around then.
Sounds about right. Yes, I have read his book.
Fundamental work. By then I was over at MIT. It's quite a different environment. Everything was totally open. People at the research lab of electronics, there was just tremendous interdisciplinary action. First major psychologist who came there was Luke Teuber, then founded the psychology department, who was, again, very eclectic, just like George, so you could talk about anything. Jerry Bruner was not in the psychology department. He was in social relations, as you know.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
And he and George founded the Cognitive Science Center. By then, cognitive science was developing at MIT as well and went off in its own direction. Linguistics was a core part of it, but there was no separations. And it became a very different kind of period. But the 50s were pretty strange. The reason I didn't respond when Steve Harnett and you asked for comment on the paper was my own feeling, as I'd said everything I wanted to say on this topic. I didn't have anything more to say about it. My own feeling was that there was nothing that you could, there was nothing in Skinner's verbal behavior that could be salvaged, as far as I could tell. It was, if you took the terms he used literally, it just didn't make any sense. If you used them metaphorically, there were paraphrases of mentalistic terminology. So instead of saying that John wants a cookie, you can say John is reinforced when he gets a cookie. Okay. But it's not telling you anything. And with regard to language, as far as I could see, it was not dealing with the most elementary properties. But
so may I ask, with respect that you're talking mainly about the content of those papers that was concerned with verbal behavior and not with, for example, another of his papers was about ethological phenomena, in which he thought of it as his ecumenical paper with respect to making contact with Tinbergen and Lorenz and some of the others. So I assume that you didn't even see as relevant to the verbal behavior issues.
No, I didn't see that.
Yeah, okay.
We were reading Tinbergen and Lawrence and Thorpe and people like that, but as far as I could see, nobody in psychology was interested, aside from George Miller, to my knowledge. But it changed in later years, of course. It changed totally.
Yeah, we had one graduate student. Sadly, he became ill and he didn't continue. But he did this marvelous little experiment in which you start out with ducklings of the who were just recently hatched, who had become imprinted, and what he could do was to set up a little environment in which you had a little running wheel, and you had a stimulus on a pulley, so that if the duckling ran in the wheel, it either brought the stimulus closer, so getting close to mommy. If the imprinted, it was often a thing like an empty milk bottle or something, but it wasn't a mama duck, but it functioned that way. And he could hook it up so that the duckling had to run away from mommy. And if the duckling ran away from mommy, it would bring the imprinted stimulus close. If he ran toward her, it would get further away. And then he did another one in which he had a little disc on the wall. And even within the first day or two, you could shape up pecking on that disc. And the duckling would stay and peck at that disc. And that would turn on a light, which would have the mama duckling going back and forth behind this window. And so his conclusion was that it wasn't following that was the crucial thing about the imprinting, because and that sort of makes sense, because the ducklings will paddle in water, they'll walk on land, but rather the important thing about the imprinting was it made mommy a big important stimulus, or as the behavioral folks would say, it made it a reinforcer. And once it was a reinforcer, the duckling would do whatever it takes to stay close, to keep mommy close, walk away from it, walk toward her. And I always thought that was a kind of a neat extension, that people who started from that behavioral orientation were now looking at the phenomena that were regarded as crucial, and we had a relationship to talk to the ethological folks about.
Yeah, that began, you know this better than I do, but just to repeat, the this began in the early 60s. There was a lot of interesting work, including Skinner's main students like Keller and Nancy Breland, top animal trainers in the world at the time, trained all the fancy animals, Flipper and so on. But they wrote a very important paper in, I think, about 1962.
Misbehavior of organisms.
Yeah, misbehavior of organisms, in which they talked about what they called instinctual drift. The fact that when you tried to train an animal, you were in fact modifying slightly its instinctive behavior. But when you went on with the experiment, the instinctive behavior took over and the reinforcing stimuli were ignored. So I remember one of their cases was they were trying to teach a pig a trick to pick up a coin and put it in a slot, and then it would get whatever pigs like, a pellet of something. Yeah. And it all worked exactly as it was supposed to. They did the right schedule of reinforcement, and pig played the trick. But after a while, they found that the pig was slowing down. It was not going to put the pellet in the thing in the slot. It was just
rooting,
starting to starve. Would starve to death. What they finally found was that the experimenters, they thought that the pig was picking up the thing and putting it in the slot, but the pig thought it was rooting. That's the pig's instinctive behavior. You root to get food. And when it got hungry, it just rooted harder and harder and delayed the reinforcement longer and longer. And as I say, it would have starved to death just because the instinctive behavior was taking over.
It might have. My guess not that, but yeah, I was around and knew some of the people who were doing those kinds of things. The person who made the biggest difference with respect to all that stuff was Dave Premack. Are you familiar with Dave Premack's name? Or Dave was at Minnesota, and he also went on later to do work with chimps and all and language. But before he got around to that, his big what we call the Premack principle was that the higher probability behavior will reinforce the lower probability behavior. And so if you had, for example, a raccoon, and you give the raccoon some food, but there's no water nearby, the raccoon can't wash that food, and yet that's part of the pattern. And so what you usually find is that there's a hierarchy in which you can use, for example, with those pigs, you could use the opportunity to root to reinforce putting the coin in the slot. But people didn't think of doing that. And in those days, and by the way, Skinner was never quite comfortable with Premack and with the Premack principle, and didn't kind of think about the reversibility. But if you have a water-deprived rat that's had plenty of food, you can get it to eat in order to get something to drink. But on the other hand, if it's had plenty to drink but it hasn't had food, you can get it to drink in order to eat, and you can make it go either way. And I think the resolution over the years has been that we now see that lots of that ethological stuff essentially tells you what the dominant behavior is, and that's given by genetic histories and things that are important in the ecology of these different creatures, and will be different for all of them. But I think we've come to a point where we can see how, again, it satisfies me because it's a way of bringing these things in which people have been opposed to each other and showing that we can have a common way of thinking and talking about them.
Yeah, I think so. That was a lot of work. Again, you know it better than I do. Bob Brewer.
Yeah, we had a lot to learn back then.
And it kind of all fell together with a lot of it was reinterpreted in terms of information processing, which was also a useful way. By now, it's become quite sophisticated. People like Randy Gallistel are trying to ask whether you can even identify anything in conditioning that's not just information provision, with and a lot of neurological work on it too. But it's true. The sharp divisions of the 1950s, fortunately, eroded in later years, and there was a good deal of constructive interaction, very different from the atmosphere in the 50s, which was just kind of like cult-like in its commitment.
Yeah. I think there is one still major separation within the field of learning, and that is, I think, between the people who, and I fall in this category, who look at a lot of behavior in terms of selection. That is, in ontogeny, you think of an organism as being this population of lots of different bits of behavior, and some of them produce certain consequences and they continue on, and others fall by the wayside. And so selection is sort of the dominant way of thinking about things. And on the other side, and this is especially true in the British folks coming out of the Oxford, Cambridge axis, and who are still thinking in terms mainly of associations. And I think that does separate people. I think and I like to think of associations as being things that get selected along with a lot of other kinds of things that can be selected. So I tend to think of it as being more general and encompassing both. I think we have a ways to go to somehow find the ways in which to connect those. There are a couple of people who have models which show that both reinforcement phenomena and conditioning phenomena could be reduced to similar kinds of neural systems and so forth. And so I think we have ways to go there. My
own feeling is that in the longer term, the concept of learning is going to essentially disappear, be recognized to be not a proper category of development and ontogeny. I mean, if you think about it, every kind of change in an organism from conception to death involves all of the three possible factors that enter into organism change. One is the internal structure of the organism. Originally, its innate capacities changing through time. Second is the whatever stimuli there are. Third is laws of nature, which simply require that things develop in certain patterns and not others. This is developed in biology as well. And if the innate capacity has a larger role, you call it growth. If stimuli have a larger role, you call it learning, but there's really no boundary. It's just a mixture of all three at every point. This is growth and development. That's why the study of language learning has been called language acquisition.
I don't know whether I should do this or not, but
learn.
This is the name of one of my, and it's too big and it's too old and it's obsolete now, but I am pleased in response to what you just said to be able to say that the first paragraph is, what is learning? And then I go through a list of things and then say in the end, no, we can't define learning. It is just a colloquial term and it encompasses so many different things that there's nothing that all instances of learning have in common that's useful to us. So, but you have to call the book something. and
no,
this was the last edition. It's now, I think, obsolete, but I'm amused that we agree on that totally.
Good. Even the examples that are taken language, again, my own particular interest, that are called the paradigm cases of learning, like word learning. How do you learn that in English you call it a tree, in German you call it a baum, and French arbre, and so on? That's called paradigmatic learning. It involves a rich array of instinctive behaviors. The set of possible sound combinations is fixed in advance. An ape can't do any of this. It doesn't have the instinctive structure of phonetic characters and distinctive features. The concepts are rich in character when you look at them, and they're all there to start with prior to the acquisition. So what you have is a rich interplay of innate structure and some stimuli, which is the paradigm case of learning. And that's true of every case. That's just too much. It's just constant mixture. And in fact, as has been learned over the years, physical law is playing a large part of it. In the case of language, that means efficient computation. Turns out to be playing principles of efficient computation play a large role in the way the system develops. Well, all of these things interact.
That suggests me another question, which was on my list of things we might talk about. And by the way, I haven't put the list up, and probably we don't need to bother with it because. But in any case, one of the other things that I've worried about a bit over the years is the poverty of the stimulus. And let me try this out to be sure that my understanding of the way you introduced the idea of the poverty of the stimulus was that the child has to be exposed somehow to these contrasts, including some things that are totally ungrammatical and would never, but some of these the child will never have heard. But because of the way the language is structured and organized, if the child should be exposed to this, the child will recognize this as an ungrammatical sentence. Yet there's many kinds of learning phenomena that people have studied in which you don't need you don't need to be exposed to many of the negative instances. It only takes one contrast. So, for example, if you let me use as the example the spectrum. You can raise a duckling in monochromatic light, so it never sees anything but this one yellow. And then after it's had that training, after it's had that history, it's never seen different colors, unless maybe there is some contrast effects that come out. But you now teach it to peck a disc when the key is yellow and not to peck the disc when the key is blue. And what you'll find is its pecking then is in an orderly way responsive to the entire spectrum. So that just creating that one contrast between two colors is enough to then tap into the structure of the spectrum. Is that a decent analogy to the kinds of things you'd say about grammatical structure? That you get a couple of examples, and because of the structure of these particular utterances, you will have an orderly set of relations among the ones, including those you haven't even ever heard before?
Well, the examples of the ungrammatical sentences were just illustrations of the fact that poverty of stimulus is overwhelming. The child doesn't use negative examples in acquiring a language.
Yeah. Okay.
In fact, there's pretty good evidence by now that children learn language from positive examples only. They don't pay attention to corrections. If you've had a young child, you've had that experience, just ignores when you try to correct it. It just pays attention to whatever data is going on in the ambient language, and its instinctive capacities just create a language out of it. The poverty of stimulus is so overwhelming that you just don't need evidence for it anymore. By now, we know that children of 2 or 3 years old have virtually acquired the essential characters of the languages, can be shown by experiment, even though they have
I'm totally.
It goes way beyond the evidence available to them. And in fact, by now, statistical studies of evidence available which you can do these days. Charles Yang's work shows that it's extremely impoverished. If you bring into account Zipf's law, the rank frequency laws, you find that trigrams are all totally missing, bigrams are rare. What the child knows goes vastly beyond anything that's experienced, and most of it is just coming from the inside. So the questions of poverty of stimulus, in my view, barely have to be discussed anymore because the evidence is so overwhelming that what the child knows is far beyond, vastly beyond any possible data it had. All of this was, in my view, pretty clear by the early 50s, but by now it's been well established by experiment, Lila Gleitman's work, her associates and others. So
but here
much of what the
may
child
I assume we're mainly talking about grammatical structure and not things like vocabulary, where the vocabulary really has to depend upon the experience within this community. Because if the words aren't there, you're not going to learn words you can extend.
Yeah, that's the paradigm example. But even that example doesn't work for the reasons I mentioned. So if you want to know whether that thing over there is called tree, you have to have in your mind already coded in your brain before this experience altogether. You have to have the set of possible phonological forms, which is very narrow and restricted. That's given by nature. You have to have the set of concepts, all given by nature. And the one thing you learn is pretty trivial. Just associate this possible form with this possible concept. Now, you can learn that in 2 or 3 presentations, but then all the rich knowledge about the meaning of the word and the pronunciation of the word is already available. In fact, Gleitman's work has actually shown that couple of presentations, 2 or 3, is enough for the child to acquire the sound meaning correspondence and know the nature of the word with all of its richness and complexity.
Well, there is some behavioral people doing similar kinds of things.
Paradigmatic case of learning involves extremely rich innate structure. Mm-hmm. And more than that, the laws of phonology themselves are determined in part by just computational efficiency principles.
But they're going to be different in different languages, right? So what about the where I have trouble thinking these kinds of things through is what are the natural things that would be involved if you're talking about the different kinds of phonology you have, say, if somebody's learning Dutch or somebody's learning Japanese or Chinese. In Chinese, you've got the tonal differences, which I have a colleague. Actually, he's an engineer, but I talked to him. And he's now learning Mandarin, and he's talking about the trouble he's having hearing the tonal differences. There's a little bit of tonal stuff in Norwegian, but not much. In most European languages, we don't worry about it. But each of the children who are being raised in these different communities is getting exposed to different kinds of things. And so what is the universe, when you're saying that these are given somehow
universal principles?
What are the universals with respect to, say, phonetics, which varies so...
Even with regard to phonetics, the universal principles are very profound. There are very few options among all the sound structures that you can imagine. There's an extremely narrow range of options that the child immediately hits upon to say, this is language. You take a newborn infant, it hears all kinds of noise. For a chimpanzee, that's just noise, it remains noise. But the child instantly, at the very beginning, picks out the parts of the noise that are language related. And
maybe even prenatally, I understand.
Them in kind of a fixed structure of possible phonological structures. So take the Japanese English case. By about 10 months, a Japanese infant no longer distinguishes R and L. And by about the same period, an English-speaking influence doesn't distinguish Arabic emphatic, non-emphatic consonants. All of this stuff works.
Or the B versus P in Arabic, right?
Yeah, right. All of this goes by a pre-programmed innate structure, very similar to a child acquiring the ability to walk. We don't say a child learns to walk. It just develops walking as part of its maturational development. And very much the same seems to be true of development of even phonetics. When you get into grammatical structure and like that, the universals are far deeper and the possible ranges are far left. By now it's becoming.
And somehow what troubles me there is that the nature of those universals is kind of strange, because after all, you've got the diaphragm, the lungs, the vocal cords, the lips, the teeth, to start saying all of these kinds of things and to make those different sounds. It's such a complex set of coordinations. The timing matters, because when you're starting to exhale, it's going to be a while before the air gets to those places, and somehow that's got to be shaped up. I've looked into a bit of the developmental phonology, and I also used to be involved with a group that was a European group in which I mentioned Dutch in particular because there was this one Dutch linguist who said that there are some kinds of sounds in Dutch that the kids don't end up getting right until they're 8 or 9 years old. Maybe he's wrong, but he was a Dutch native speaker and he was a linguist. He was concerned with phonology.
Established much earlier. There are some cases of grammatical structures, pretty complex ones, that children don't really get fixed properly until about 8 or 9. But not phonetics. That's just said immediately. And notice, incidentally, that the phonetics is basically irrelevant to language. A deaf child will learn sign, no phonetics, and have perfectly competent language. If you look at the way we now pretty well understand that what we call language has two almost totally different components. One part is an internal computational system, which basically yields what we call meaning, basically yields thought. Our thoughts are just constructed by fixed internal principles of grammatical structure. Then there's a second part that we call language, which is externalization, mapping this internal thing into some sensory motor medium. But that's quite separate. If you want an analogy, it's something like you have a computer program in your laptop, maybe for calculation. You can hook it up to one or another printer. The internal system doesn't care what printer you hook it up to. Seems to be pretty much the way language works. The internal system is just fixed, coded internally. You have no conscious awareness of it. It's all going on, inaccessible to consciousness. And then it gets externalized into one or another sensory motor medium. Usually sound, can be sight, can even be touch. It's not smell because we don't have enough.
See if I'm following this. Would it be, and if you're talking, say, about locomotion, and you were looking at the different gaits in a horse's locomotion, it could be trotting, it could be galloping, it could be, and there are certain kinds of coordinations among the legs and the muscles with respect to the individual limbs. And there are some things that it wouldn't naturally do that you can maybe get it to do, like to get the liposoners to do these funny steps. But presumably there are going to be other steps that are just totally, let's say ungrammatical with respect to horses' locomotion. So would we say that the nervous system is built in such a way to allow certain classes of coordinations, which maybe you could come up with some mathematical descriptions of, and that's totally different from the question of when the horse is going to switch from one gait to another, and where it's going to go? Is that would that be analogous to the kind of difference you're talking about between the internal and the external with respect to language?
Well, you remember that was one of Lashley's main examples, gate of horses, showing that there's only certain options available. You can gallop, you can, I forget what the other names are called, canter and so on. But this is just...
I might have been just showing off that I did remember a little Lashley.
But notice that all of this is externalization. In the case of language, there's a lot of structure to the sensory motor systems. The visual and gestural systems have their own structure. The articulatory system has its own structure. The perceptual auditory system has its own structure. None of this has anything to do with language. All of these systems were in place long before language ever emerged, and they haven't changed at all with the appearance of language. So these are just like a printer attached to your laptop. They're basically they're non-linguistic systems. In fact, even the fact that language is produced word after word has nothing to do with language. The internal system is unordered. You can show that. The internal system that generates thoughts has no order. The order is imposed by a non-linguistic articulatory system, which is unable to produce structures, so it has to produce them word by word. Process of linearization actually is outside of language. It's a property of sensory motor systems that were there long before language appeared and have no...
So language emerged when, do you suppose?
When
Could we talk maybe a little about the evolution of language and what your views on that are?
We now have some evidence on that. It's a hard problem, but the basic story is this. There's good evidence now that modern humans appeared roughly 200 to 300,000 years ago. There's now genomic evidence, solid genomic evidence, that shows that humans began to separate not very long after that, maybe on the order of 150,000 years or so. In evolutionary time, that's nothing. So, and the groups that separated all have the faculty of language, same faculty of language, which means it must have been in place before the separation. Well, furthermore, if you look at the archaeological record, paleontological record, there's no evidence, virtually no evidence of any symbolic activity before the emergence of modern humans. You get some marks and shells and stuff, but basically nothing. After the emergence of humans, you pretty quickly get very complex symbolic activity and complex societies and so on. Put all this together, it looks as though the language capacity developed pretty much along with modern humans. It must have been some slight rewiring of the brain that gave the basic property of language, which is the property of recursive enumeration of a digital infinity of structured expressions. Could be a very small...
Actually, going from 1 to 2 is a pretty big step all by itself before you get to recursiveness. I mean, I've been involved with on and off with a strange group called the Language Origin Society. That's where I met that Belgian linguist. What I found curious was that among this group of people, and they included linguists and anthropologists and psychologists and people from all sorts of disciplines. The guy who founded it was an ear, nose, and throat doctor who was interested in how much we could say about what Neanderthals sounded like based on what we knew of the anatomy. But one of the consistent things was a debate with some people saying human language was a couple of million years old. And their basis for saying that was the evidence of chipped stones and fire and habitations that were all within earshot of each other. And then there was another group that was saying it was essentially 100,000 to 50,000 years old, which was mainly folks with much more linguistic backgrounds, and one of the things that couldn't have been happening over those couple of million years was any kind of multiple word utterances, because we know that primates have various kinds of sounds that they make that do essentially command behavior on the part of other members of the troop. Gorillas make certain sounds that will, and some of them will single out another individual gorilla to change its behavior. But somewhere more recently came the possibility of combining two or more words, where the two words had different functions. And that sort of makes me think of things like the Cambrian revolution, where once you had multi-celled organisms come together, you had an explosion of diversity. And there you have...
If you look at this field, there's all kinds of what evolutionary biologists call just so stories. Maybe that, maybe the other thing. But there's also evidence. The evidence is what I just described. The language faculty was apparently in place before the separation of the small group of Homo sapiens. That would put it not long after the appearance of modern humans. Before the existence of modern humans, there's basically nothing in the archaeological record that indicates any symbolic activity. You do get a series of chips. There's new work by Stan Dehane at the Paris and his group showing that 500,000 or 600,000 years ago, that's well before language, you start getting geometrical configurations. So humans began constructing geometrical objects and, in fact, organizing them in terms of simplicity of organization. But that has almost, that may be some...
Oh yeah, you can't tell anybody how to chip one of those things. The only way you could do it is to show them how to do it. I mean, just like trying to teach somebody to tie shoelaces by only talking to them, it would be very hard to do. So yeah, I wasn't suggesting
I understand that it's possible that this is some deep precursor of language, but it doesn't get you to recursive enumeration of a digitally infinite set. That's the crucial thing that's part of language. You don't find it anywhere else. And it's not a matter of going from 2 to 3. This is actually something that Darwin and Wallace were puzzled by. They wondered how it could be that humans, they assumed, all have arithmetical capacity. The knowledge that the numbers go on forever, that you can add and multiply. They didn't know that, but they assumed it correctly, it turns out. That, and they asked, how could this be, since there was never any selection for language, since it was never used. They had a long debate about this. Well, we now have some hint as to what it might be. It's possible that the kind of the elementary operations that yield recursive enumeration, if they're simple enough, give the fundamentals of arithmetic. So it may be that the same neural change, small neural change that yielded the faculty of language also yielded the mathematical faculty. Dehane's results suggest that even something earlier might have split off to give other kinds of capacity to deal with structures. But there's nothing in Dehane's work that shows any evidence of recursive enumeration. And also he shows that different parts of the brain are involved, not the parts that are involved in language faculty. So there are bits and pieces of evidence accumulating as to what might have happened. But I think we should dismiss the stories that are produced about what might have happened. Yet anything might have happened.
But language had to have some kind of function for it to have, so let me. What I'd like to do at this point is to describe a set of a body of research on verbal behavior that is about the functions of language. And you've talked about structure quite a bit, not so much about what language does. And of course, what language has got to be part of in some ways, it's social behavior. And as far as I can tell, I have not been able to come up with any function of language that is an irreducible function, other than we came up with this really elegant way in which one individual can get another individual to do something. And some other organisms do a little of that, but we do it in an amazingly varied way. And we see it happening in politics, and we see it happening in all kinds of areas. I mean, it's one of the things that kept coming back to me as we went through our political turmoil in recent years was that the idea that language is rational is a very limited value when you see what politicians can do with words, and how the words don't have to have any consistent relationships with the way things are in the world. So there's a body of research now in which people have been working with using reinforcement, shaping what people say. And it goes something like this. You have a kid pressing a button, and the kid's pressing the button fast when one light's on, and pressing the button fast when another light's on. And that's what kids will do under a lot of circumstances. And then you have a hand puppet starts talking with the kid and saying, teach me how to play that game. And you get the kid to say something like, well, the way this one works is you got to press it a lot without stopping. And the way this one works is you got to press and wait and press and wait. And if the person doing this is successful in getting the kid to say that, that's what the kid begins to do. So that there seems to be this linkage between talk and doing things that is a very fundamental thing. It works with preschoolers. It works very soon after they become to the point where they're talking full sentences. Comes in somewhere between the ages of 2 and 4. It also works with college undergraduates. It works, and you can also find it in other places. Now, to me, that's a and it does. So that's a thing that's really orthogonal to questions about whether what you're saying is grammatical or not. It's about how the behavior works. And it troubles me because it does suggest that if you have a group of people who talk only to each other, and they all get each other talking in certain ways, that the group can begin doing things. And maybe some of the things that we worry about with religious extremism and all can be related to these kinds of phenomena. I wonder if you have any thoughts about these directions and these functions of language. Have you worked? And I know you have interest in politics as well. So
I say most of my life is devoted to these questions.
Yeah.
But these are totally separate.
Oh, I grant you that.
Of the nature and origin of language. There's some important things to remember about evolution, which are often overlooked. The process of evolution pays almost no attention to function. So if you schematically look at evolution, how does it work? You have some system, maybe bacteria, and some accidental event takes place which disrupts the system. Could be a mutation, could be genetic drift, could be gene transfer. It could be, in fact, sometimes is, one microorganism accidentally swallowing another, which happens to be what led to the development of eukaryotic complex cells, us. Otherwise, we'd all be bacteria if that hadn't happened. So you have some accidental event that takes place. Then nature comes along and develops the optimal analysis, the optimal structure for that new system. Just the way physics determines that when bees poke through a substance, it becomes hexagons. They're not they're not trying to make hexagons. It's physics that does that. And the same is true of evolution. So the first stage is just some random event. Second stage is nature structuring this in the optimal fashion. And the third stage is natural selection. Those that reproduce more tend to stick around. But at the second stage, constructing the system, nature hasn't any idea what the function is going to be.
Well, of course not.
Things are not created because of a function. So, for example, and that's true of everything, language and everything else. So I use my fingers to type, but nature had no knowledge of that when it developed fingers. And the same is true of evolution generally. So functions only appear at the third stage when you're getting reproductive success. Now, in the case of language, it looks as if the third stage was never reached, maybe because of lack of time. But as far as we know, all humans, no matter how separate they are, have exactly the same faculty of language and cognitive faculties generally. It seems like humans have very little genetic variation, very slight. And the faculty of language, other cognitive capacities seem to be shared completely. So it looks as if the third stage of natural selection was never reached for language. Only the second stage of constructing the simplest possible system once some disruption took place. So a possible scenario is that some minor rewiring of the brain yielded recursive enumeration of digital infinity. Then nature constructed the simplest possible system for the internal language, the language of thought. Then when you get to the externalization, you have to ask, how do you relate this to systems that have been around for millions of years and have nothing to do with language? And that's where you get the phonetic questions and the questions of gesture and sign and so on. But remember, they are not linguistic questions. They are questions about systems that have no connection with language. But we have to basically make a distinction that actually goes back to Aristotle between possession of knowledge and use of knowledge. Those are very different things. Study of the structure and nature of a system is possession. Use is a different story, and it involves all sorts of other things. So these are just two different enterprises. It's not a matter of better or worse. Two different enterprises that have to be separated from one another.
But for me, there's still one major thing left out. I mean, whatever is going on inside, there's still got to be an environment. I mean, there are things out there, we look at them, and then we say their names, or we say something about these other kinds of things. There's got to be a way in which the environment then determines some of the things we have to say. I mean, it's one thing for them for us to talk grammatically, but it's something else to have something to say about what's going on.
That's right.
And there, I think we need some story about how the environment is doing things. Now, one thing we do know is that some of the organization of the brain is determined by the environment. So, for example, well, I'll take an example that I know pretty well because my son's in biology and he's worked with a little creature called the star-nosed mole. And the star-nosed mole has these rays. Actually, I could, if we do have a share screen here, so let me just, I'll put this one up.
Well, we have very good examples for humans. Okay.
You were screen sharing. Let's see. I'm trying to I'm not sure.
Well, we don't have to. We don't have to because they're
well. Anyway, don't worry. It's the star-nosed mole has these 12 rays on these 11 rays on each side of its head, and it's a tactile organ, and it goes down its tunnels and all, and it's feeling for little insects and tiny things. But if you then look at the projection areas on the cortex, there are stripes corresponding to each of these rays. And so if for the 11 stripes on the right side, there are 11 stripes on the left cortex. For the 11 stripes on the other side, there's, if you capture one, though, that happens to have developed with 12 stripes or with 10 stripes, that's the number of stripes you find on the cortex. So the cortex and these divisions between the separate rays, their representation on the cortex is driven by what's out there in the periphery. And when I asked him, by the way, what he was studying, he told me, I study homunculi, which was a kind of an interesting thing for be told as a behavior person. So the boundaries are created by the periphery, and so this leads me to wonder how much of this organization then is driven by environments, not simply by the genetic history.
Yeah, actually, a lot is known about this in classic work. Including human vision.
Of course, there's the human homunculus and the fingers and the arms and so forth.
Classic studies by Hubel and Wiesel back in the late 50s, for which
they were working when I was a graduate student, and
they received the Nobel Prize for showing how in the mammalian visual cortex, the first few weeks of life yield stimuli which determine the structure of the striate cortex, the peripheral processing. So if you present a kitten, if you don't present a kitten with structured stimuli, it'll be blind for the rest of its life. The relevant parts of the peripheral visual cortex just don't develop. If you give it horizontal lines, it'll be attuned in later life to recognizing horizontal lines, vertical lines otherwise. So there's been a lot of work on that, particularly the visual cortex, but it works for all systems. The very early period of life does affect the structure of the neural system. And there may be some epigenetic effects later. They're pretty hard to detect, but they're possibly there. But these don't really affect the question that we're discussing. The fundamental for language and other cognitive systems, as far as we know anything about them, the basic structure is given innately. There are modifications that come from interactions with the environment. But if we're looking at the evolution of the system, these environmental effects are much later. The basic story is you get a random event which disrupted the system, say bacteria or other systems, then restructuring in the optimal fashion, then possible effects of natural selection, which for humans never seem to have happened because maybe there was not enough time. It's a very brief period that we're talking about. These numbers, like a couple 100,000 years, are an eye blink in evolutionary history. So we're talking about something almost instantaneous. And if we put aside all the just so stories, all we know about the evolution is there apparently the human language faculty and everything goes along with it, faculty of thought and so on, came along with modern humans, roughly on the order of 200,000 to 300,000 years ago. It's apparently never changed since. After the separation, which was not long after, remains the same. And there's basically nothing like it before. It's been well recognized by evolutionary biologists.
Do you think it's going to turn out it was a lethal mutation in the direction in which we're going in politics?
I think there's very good reason to believe that. There's very good reason to believe that higher intelligence altogether, what we call higher intelligence, is a lethal mutation. Fermi's paradox bears on this. This is Enrico Fermi, great astrophysicist, asked one simple question: where are they? How come, with all the massive efforts to find some sign of intelligent life somewhere, we come up with nothing? He recognized, as a distinguished astrophysicist, that there's innumerable number of planets that share enough of the properties of Earth so that they could have developed intelligent life. So why don't we hear anything from them? Well, when he brought this question up, John von Neumann, great mathematician, apparently answered that any intelligent life would develop nuclear energy and they would destroy themselves by radiation. So they're not around. Others have speculated otherwise. But if we look at current human behavior, the way we're dealing with the impending climate crisis, for example, it does look as if there's an unbridgeable gap between our technical capacity to destroy and our moral capacity to overcome it. And that might be the reason why we never hear any indication of any other intelligent life. It's just a lethal mutation. We're trying to show that right now.
I hate to kind of close with that unhappy note. I somehow feel that should we keep on going, or I somehow feel there are so many questions we could still talk about. I mean, there are things we haven't discussed, like modular structures and so forth. Should we keep going for a while, or would you be willing to consider another one of these talks sometime?
Why don't we try to reschedule? Because I have to. Can we reschedule to continue sometime?
I would think that's up to our hosts.
Let's try, because there are a lot of things to talk about.
Yeah, you can continue. Go ahead. Don't worry.
Okay. Sorry,
it's been a pleasure talking to you. I appreciate the opportunity.
My pleasure.
We have a few loose ends, of course, but
and even to remember the 1950s, long time ago. Not many people remember.
All right. Well, then I guess we'll take leave and we'll wait to hear from our hosts.
Good. Let's be in touch.
Good. Thank you.
Hey, thank you.
Bye. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Gracias por ver este vídeo. Os dejamos por aquí un enlace a nuestra última formación y por aquí algunos vídeos que os pueden resultar de interés. Si estáis buscando ayuda psicológica, también podéis mirar en la descripción del vídeo, donde encontraréis nuestra web y podréis solicitar asistencia terapéutica de un profesional confiable y que os ofrecerá ayuda psicológica basada en evidencia científica.